Sophie Bennett had no idea the impatient customer in her tailor shop was one of America's most feared mafia bosses. When his armed men tried to force 6 waiting customers outside, she pointed at the door and ordered all of them to leave. Then, someone whispered his name. Matteo Rinaldi expected fear, an apology, and immediate service. Instead, Sophie examined his jacket and told him the truth no elite tailor had dared to say. The expensive suit was hurting his injured shoulder. Matteo left without another word. The next morning, he returned, pulled a number, and waited like everyone else.
20 minutes earlier, Sophie Bennett had been dealing with 6 customers, 3 unfinished fittings, and a bride whose mother had called twice about a hemline when the bell over the door opened, and 4 large men entered, as if the building belonged to them. Then Matteo walked in behind them. Even before Sophie knew who he was, she noticed 2 things. First, he was unfairly handsome. Dark hair, broad shoulders, an expensive charcoal suit that probably cost more than some of the cars parked outside. Second, he had absolutely no intention of waiting. One of his men stepped toward the counter. "Mr. Rinaldi needs an alteration completed immediately." Sophie glanced at the numbered tickets in the hands of her waiting customers. "Then, Mr. Rinaldi needs a number." Silence. Matteo looked at her. "I have a meeting in 90 minutes. And Mrs. Alvarez has a wedding on Saturday." An elderly woman clutching a garment bag suddenly looked as if she wished Sophie had left her out of this. Matteo placed his jacket on the counter. "Triple your normal fee." "No." 5 times. "No." His expression barely changed. That should have warned her. Instead, Sophie pointed toward the ticket dispenser. "Number." One of Matteo's bodyguards turned toward the waiting customers. "Everyone needs to leave." That was when Sophie lost her patience. She came around the counter, planted herself between the men and her customers, and pointed toward the door. "Get out of my shop!" Nobody moved. Then a customer near the fitting rooms whispered, "Oh my God!" Sophie heard another voice behind her. "That's Matteo Rinaldi." The name landed differently. Sophie knew it. Everyone did. Matteo Rinaldi wasn't merely wealthy. Newspapers attached his name to shipping companies, hotels, construction firms, real estate towers, and investment groups worth billions. Other stories attached his name to things newspapers were considerably more careful about printing. A criminal organization stretching across several major cities. Men who feared him. Men who disappeared from rooms when he entered them. Sophie slowly looked back at the man she had just ordered onto the sidewalk. Her stomach dropped. Matteo watched recognition arrive on her face. He had probably seen that transformation 1,000 times. The moment irritation became fear, and fear became obedience. Sophie was afraid. She simply disliked being bullied more. Matteo glanced toward the door. "I assume you'd like to reconsider." Sophie swallowed. Then her eyes fell to the jacket on the counter. Something about it had bothered her from the moment he entered. She picked it up. One of the bodyguards moved. Matteo lifted one finger. The man stopped instantly. Sophie studied the jacket, then looked at Matteo's shoulders. Who tailored this? Matteo's eyes narrowed. Why? Because whoever did it is either afraid of you or lying to you. Nobody breathed. Sophie touched the fabric near one shoulder. You have an old imbalance here. Injury? Matteo said nothing. That was answer enough. They tried to hide it by forcing symmetry into the jacket. But your body isn't symmetrical anymore. The extra structure is pulling against your natural movement. She showed him the tension line, almost invisible beneath the arm. It makes the jacket look perfect when you're standing still. The moment you move, it fights you. Matteo looked down. For the first time, his expression changed. Not anger. Interest. Can you fix it? Yes. When? Sophie walked behind the counter and opened her appointment book. She could feel 6 customers silently begging her to choose the correct answer. She checked the schedule. Thursday. Matteo stared at her. It was Tuesday. Sophie stared back. For a man like Matteo Rinaldi, 2 days might as well have been 2 years. Finally, he picked up his jacket. Thursday. Then he walked out. Only after the door closed did Sophie realize she had been holding her breath. What she didn't know was that Matteo Rinaldi would not wait until Thursday.
At 9:15 the next morning, the bell over Bennett Alterations rang. Every conversation in the shop stopped. Sophie looked up from her counter and nearly dropped her measuring tape. Matteo Rinaldi had returned. His appointment was tomorrow. 2 of his bodyguards entered behind him, but this time nobody asked a customer to leave. Nobody approached the counter. Nobody announced his name. Matteo simply walked to the ticket dispenser. He studied it for a moment, then pulled a number. 17. A woman waiting with 3 school uniforms stared at him. An older man holding a pair of trousers quietly checked his own ticket. 16. The relief on his face was almost spiritual. Matteo sat down. Sophie stared at him. He stared back. She finally said, "Your appointment is Thursday." "I know. Today is Wednesday." "I'm aware." "Then why are you here?" Matteo lifted a garment bag resting across his knees. Another jacket. Of course he had another jacket. Sophie looked at the 6 customers ahead of him. Number 17. "I know." And Matteo Rinaldi waited for 38 minutes. Sophie knew because she checked the clock 4 times. Nobody else in the shop seemed capable of behaving normally. Customers whispered instead of speaking. One man refused to sit in the empty chair beside Matteo. A little boy kept staring at the bodyguards until his mother physically turned his head toward the wall. Matteo appeared completely unbothered. Finally, Sophie called. 17. He stood. One bodyguard instinctively moved with him. Sophie pointed at the chairs. Just him. The bodyguard looked at Matteo. Matteo gave a small nod. He approached the counter alone and placed the garment bag in front of Sophie. She opened it. Another expensive jacket. Naturally, she inspected the shoulders, seams, sleeve pitch, balance, and drape. Then she looked at Matteo. "What's wrong with it?" "You tell me." Sophie examined it again. Nothing. She had Matteo put it on. Annoyingly, it fit beautifully. She walked around him once, adjusted the collar, checked the back, then stepped away. Nothing. "Check again." She gave him a flat look. Then she checked again. Still nothing. Sophie returned to the counter and wrote something on a receipt. Matteo glanced down. "What's that?" "Consultation fee." One of his bodyguards made a strange sound that might have been a cough. Matteo looked at the amount. "You are charging me to tell me nothing is wrong? I'm charging you because you made me check twice." For several seconds, Sophie couldn't read his expression. Then Matteo took out his wallet. He paid. That should have been the end of it. It wasn't. The following week, Matteo brought trousers that needed half an inch removed from the hem. A few days later, a dinner jacket arrived with a legitimate sleeve problem. Then came a navy suit Sophie could find absolutely nothing wrong with. "Maybe the waist," Matteo suggested. "The waist is fine." "The shoulders?" "Also fine." "The sleeves?" "Matteo." He stopped. Sophie folded her arms. "Are you emotionally attached to paying consultation fees?" Something almost resembling amusement appeared in his eyes. "Perhaps I appreciate professional certainty." $35. He paid. The visits continued, not constantly, not enough to become ridiculous, just often enough for Sophie to notice. Sometimes Matteo genuinely needed her expertise. His original jacket, once reconstructed around the reality of his injured shoulder, instead of forcing his body into artificial symmetry. fit better than anything he had worn in years. That alone gave him a perfectly reasonable excuse to return. But reasonable excuses did not explain the perfectly fitted black coat, or the trousers Sophie suspected had been deliberately pinned incorrectly before he arrived. By the 4th week, even Matteo's bodyguard seemed embarrassed. One afternoon, Sophie examined a grey jacket while Matteo stood in front of the mirror. "This button is loose," he said. Sophie touched it. It was not. She looked at his reflection. He looked calmly back. She tightened it anyway. $10. He paid without argument. Something had changed inside Bennett Alterations. Outside those doors, people rearranged schedules for Matteo Rinaldi. Restaurant tables appeared without reservations. Meetings waited for his arrival. Powerful men answered when he called. Inside Sophie's shop, none of that mattered. Here, he was number 17. He waited his turn. He didn't lean on her counter. The fitting room was on the left, and somewhere between the unnecessary jackets, consultation fees, and Sophie's increasingly suspicious looks, Matteo discovered something he had not expected. He liked it there. Sophie assumed it was because nobody treated him like Matteo Rinaldi. She was only partly right. The explanation came on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, nearly 6 weeks after Matteo Rinaldi had first been thrown out of Bennett Alterations. Sophie was checking the fit of his original charcoal jacket. She had rebuilt part of the internal structure, adjusted the shoulder line, and changed the way the fabric distributed tension across his upper back. The difference was subtle to anyone else. To Matteo, it was not. He rolled his injured shoulder once, then again. The pain is less. Sophie looked up. What? When I wear a jacket for several hours, my shoulder usually starts aching. He moved his arm experimentally. This one doesn't. Sophie studied him for a moment. How old is the injury? Matteo was silent long enough that she assumed he would ignore the question. 14 years. That surprised her. And nobody fixed your jackets properly in 14 years. I've had very expensive tailors. That wasn't my question. His eyes settled on hers. There it was again. That strange moment Sophie had begun recognizing whenever she spoke to him differently from everyone else. Most people seemed to approach Matteo by calculating what they should not say. Sophie usually discovered what she should not say approximately 3 seconds after saying it. Matteo glanced toward the mirror. They noticed. Sophie frowned. Then why didn't they correct it? They corrected what they thought I wanted people to see. He explained that after the injury, one shoulder had healed with slightly reduced mobility. Nothing dramatic. Nothing most people would notice. But Matteo had noticed. So had his tailors. Instead of designing around the change, they had built structure into his jackets to conceal it. More padding, more reinforcement, artificial symmetry. Each adjustment made him appear physically perfect while making the clothes less comfortable to wear. Did you tell them it hurt? Matteo looked almost amused by the question. They told me it looked excellent. Sophie stared at him. Those are not the same thing. No. And suddenly she understood. The problem had never really been tailoring. It was fear. People around Matteo Rinaldi had become so accustomed to giving him perfection that they had stopped giving him truth. Sophie smoothed the jacket over his shoulder. A body isn't a mistake a tailor has to hide. Matteo looked at her reflection. She continued working as she spoke. People change. They get injured. They age. They gain weight, lose weight, have babies, survive illnesses. Whatever happens, the clothing is supposed to adapt to the person. She adjusted his sleeve. Not punish them for failing to match some imaginary perfect shape. Matteo was quiet. For Sophie, it was simply tailoring, For him, the words seemed to land somewhere else. Perhaps because Sophie had never treated his shoulder as weakness. She had simply acknowledged reality and worked with it. She did the same thing with people. Over the following weeks, Sophie began noticing things about Matteo too. He remembered details, not performatively, quietly. When Mrs. Alvarez returned for another alteration, Matteo remembered that her granddaughter's wedding had been postponed because the groom broke his ankle. When Sophie complained once that a supplier kept sending the wrong silk thread, Matteo remembered the exact color 3 weeks later. And when he noticed Sophie rubbing her eyes after working through lunch, he did not offer to buy her shop, hire her staff, or solve her life. He simply looked at the sandwich untouched beside her sewing machine. "You haven't eaten?" "I've been busy." "So have I." "And?" "I ate." Sophie pointed toward the waiting area. "Number 23. Matteo looked at his ticket. 26. Then sat down. 3 customers later, an elderly man entered carrying an old wool coat. He had no appointment. His wife had died recently, he explained, and the coat had belonged to her father. He wanted it repaired before giving it to his grandson. Sophie knew immediately the job would take longer than she had available. She also knew she couldn't rush him. So she listened. The appointment ran 25 minutes over. Matteo waited. No impatience. No glance at his watch. No assistant stepping forward to remind anyone who he was. When Sophie finally called his number, she apologized. "You waited almost 40 minutes. Matteo stood. So did everyone else. She looked at him differently then. Not because he had waited. Because he had understood why. Somewhere along the way, the man who once expected 6 strangers to be removed for his convenience had learned that being important didn't make everyone else's time less valuable. And somewhere along the way, Sophie had stopped feeling relieved when Matteo walked out of her shop. Now she noticed when he hadn't walked in. Neither of them said anything about that. Not yet. Matteo first met Daniel Reyes on a Thursday afternoon. Technically, met was generous. Daniel walked into Bennett Alterations, carrying 2 coffees, smiled at Sophie, and Matteo immediately disliked the situation. "You're late," Sophie said. "By 3 minutes." 4. Daniel handed her one of the cups. "Caramel latte. Extra shot. Consider this a formal apology." Sophie accepted it without checking the label. That was the first problem. She already knew what he had brought. Daniel was 37, an architect, and apparently comfortable enough in Sophie's shop to hang his coat behind the counter without asking. That was the second problem. Matteo sat in the waiting area holding number 31. He watched Daniel hand Sophie a navy suit. "You finally ruined it. I prefer the term structurally challenged. You caught the pocket on something again. A door handle attacked me." Sophie laughed. That was the third problem. Matteo looked down at his ticket, then back at Daniel. Daniel eventually noticed him. Like most people, recognition changed his expression for half a second. Unlike most people, he recovered quickly. He gave Matteo a polite nod. Matteo returned it. Sophie examined the damaged pocket. "You've been bringing me this suit for what, 3 years?" 4. Matteo spoke, before deciding whether the question was necessary. 4 years? Sophie looked over. "So you can hear conversations from across the room now. I was asking a question." Daniel smiled. "I've been a customer for years." Matteo nodded slowly. "Clearly." Sophie narrowed her eyes. 10 minutes later, Daniel's fitting was finished. He did not leave. Instead, he leaned against the counter and asked Sophie whether she had tried the new Italian restaurant 2 blocks away. Matteo looked up again. Daniel noticed. "Do you need the counter?" "No." "Okay." Another minute passed.
Matteo asked Sophie, "Is my appointment today?" She stared at him. "You've been holding the ticket for 20 minutes. I was confirming." Daniel glanced at Sophie. Sophie glanced at Matteo. Something clicked. Her mouth twitched. Matteo recognized the expression immediately. "What?" "Nothing." He disliked that answer even more than Daniel. Daniel eventually left. The moment the door closed, Sophie called, "31." Matteo approached. She looked at the garment bag in his hand, then at him. "How long has Daniel been a customer?" Matteo's expression remained perfectly neutral. Sophie blinked. "Did you just ask me that?" "I believe I did." "Why?" "Conversation. You don't make conversation." "Perhaps I'm developing socially." Sophie almost smiled. 4 years, and he regularly brings you coffee." There it was. Sophie folded her arms. "Matteo Rinaldi." "Yes?" "Are you jealous?" "No." The answer came too quickly. Sophie smiled fully now. Matteo placed his jacket on the counter. "The sleeve feels uneven." She did not even look at it. "You're jealous. I'm here about a jacket." "Of course you are." Several days later, Matteo returned carrying coffee. Not 1 cup. 2. Sophie stared at them, then at him. "What's this?" "Coffee." I recognized the concept. He placed 1 cup beside her. The logo belonged to an exclusive cafe across the city, where Sophie had once heard reservations were recommended for breakfast. She looked at the receipt attached to the cup, then slowly looked back at Matteo. "Are you competing with Daniel's $6 latte?" "No. This coffee cost $12. Matteo removed his coat. "Then I'm winning." Sophie laughed. Not the polite laugh she sometimes gave customers. A real one. Sudden and warm enough that she had to put the cup down. Matteo went completely still. For all the power he possessed, he had spent most of his adult life watching people measure their reactions around him. Fear carefully disguised as respect. Agreement disguised as loyalty. Flattery disguised as affection. Sophie's laughter contained none of those things. She simply found him ridiculous. And somehow, Matteo liked that more than he should have. Sophie took a sip. "It's very good." "I know. But Daniel still knows my order." Matteo's eyes narrowed slightly. She laughed again. That was when Sophie became certain. Matteo Rinaldi was jealous. And that was when Matteo began to understand the deeply inconvenient truth about jealousy. He could negotiate billion-dollar deals. He could make powerful men wait outside his office. He could control businesses across entire cities, but he could not order Sophie Bennett to prefer his coffee, or him. For perhaps the first time in his life, wanting something gave him absolutely no authority over whether he would receive it. The invitation came because of 3 dresses. Months earlier, Sophie had restored a collection of vintage evening gowns for a private client. 3 were later selected for display at a charity fashion exhibition sponsored by several prominent companies, including one connected to Matteo's hotel group. When Matteo mentioned the event, Sophie immediately shook her head. "I'm not going as your date." "I didn't ask you as my date." "Good." A pause. "I was going to." "Then it's still no." Matteo almost smiled. Instead, he handed her the invitation. "Your restoration work is being exhibited. You should be there because your name belongs beside it." That was why Sophie went. Not on Matteo's arm. Not in Matteo's car. Not as anyone's guest. She attended as Sophie Bennett, owner of Bennett Alterations. For the first hour, that distinction seemed to hold. People asked about the restored garments. Sophie explained how original seams had been preserved, how damaged beadwork had been reconstructed, and why restoration required knowing when not to make something look new. Then, Isabella Vane appeared. She was elegant in the effortless way that usually required enormous effort. Isabella had spent years advising luxury brands and companies connected to Matteo's legitimate empire on image, presentation, and social positioning. She greeted Matteo warmly, then looked at Sophie. "So this is Matteo's little tailor." Sophie smiled politely. "Sophie Bennett." "Of course." Isabella's smile did not change. "I've heard so much about you." The phrase sounded complimentary. Something about it wasn't. A few minutes later, Isabella introduced Sophie to another guest. "This is Matteo Rinaldi's little tailor. Apparently, she's been performing miracles with his suits." Sophie corrected her again. "I own Bennett Alterations." "Yes, naturally." By the third introduction, Sophie understood exactly what Isabella was doing. Nothing openly insulting. Nothing Sophie could object to without appearing overly sensitive. Just two carefully chosen words. Matteo's. Little. Her years of work disappeared inside them. Her skill became a charming service she performed for an important man. Her business became an accessory to his reputation. Sophie was deciding how directly to address it when Isabella lifted her champagne glass and turned toward a small group of investors and fashion executives. Actually, Sophie may not remain a neighborhood secret much longer. Several people looked over. Sophie frowned. Isabella continued. "There have been discussions about incorporating Bennett Alterations into a luxury fashion division associated with the Rinaldi portfolio." Sophie stopped breathing for a second. "What?" Isabella smiled. "Expanding the concept, naturally. Better location, proper capital, branding, perhaps several boutiques eventually." People immediately began congratulating Sophie. "How exciting! What an opportunity! You must be thrilled." One woman touched Sophie's arm. "You're very fortunate. Matteo clearly takes care of people he values." That was the moment the humiliation became complete. Sophie looked across the group. Matteo was no longer expressionless. His attention had fixed on Isabella with a stillness Sophie had learned to recognize. But Sophie spoke first. "Did you authorize this?" Everyone went quiet. She was looking directly at Matteo. "No." One word. Immediate. Certain. Sophie believed him. Then she turned to Isabella. "My name is Sophie Bennett." Isabella's smile tightened. "Of course. And I'm not Matteo's little tailor." Nobody moved. Sophie kept her voice calm. "I own Bennett Alterations. I built its reputation one customer at a time. And the work displayed here tonight came from my shop, because I know how to restore clothing, not because Matteo Rinaldi knows my name." Isabella lowered her glass. "I certainly didn't mean to diminish. My business is also not for sale." Sophie did not raise her voice. She didn't need to. If someone wants to discuss my company, the first person they discuss it with is me. A long silence followed. Then Matteo stepped forward, not in front of Sophie, beside her. "There have been no authorized discussions regarding the acquisition of Bennett Alterations." His voice was quiet. The room listened anyway. "No company, division, advisor, or representative under my control has permission to approach Ms. Bennett's business without her direct invitation." Isabella's face changed slightly. Matteo did not threaten her. He did not embarrass her further. He simply removed every possibility that anyone could misunderstand. Then a hotel executive approached, clearly attempting to rescue the conversation. "Mr. Rinaldi, perhaps you could introduce us properly." Matteo looked at Sophie. Something passed between them. Permission, not possession. He turned back to the group. "This is Sophie Bennett, owner of Bennett Alterations and the restoration specialist responsible for 3 of the pieces exhibited tonight. Nothing more. Not his tailor, not his guest, not a woman under his protection. Sophie Bennett, her own name, her own work, her own business." Later, as the crowd shifted toward the next exhibition room, Sophie stood beside one of the gowns she had restored. Matteo approached, but kept a careful distance. I didn't know what Isabella planned to say. I know. I would never buy your business without asking. Sophie looked at him. You couldn't afford it. Matteo raised an eyebrow. Sophie let the silence hold for one perfect second. Emotionally, for the first time that evening, he laughed. Quietly. She smiled too, but the unease inside her did not disappear. Because tonight had revealed something neither of them could solve with a joke. Inside Bennett Alterations, Matteo could take a number and become another customer. Outside it, his name changed the meaning of everything around him. A cup of coffee became a gesture people noticed. A conversation became a rumor. Professional respect became favoritism. And Sophie's success could be rewritten as something a powerful man had given her. Matteo had done everything right that evening. That was almost what made the problem harder. Sophie was beginning to care about him. But for the first time, she wondered what caring about Matteo Rinaldi might cost her identity in the eyes of everyone else. For the next few days, Sophie kept thinking about the charity event. Not Isabella. That part was easy. Sophie had dealt with condescension before. People had underestimated her shop because it was small, underestimated her work because alterations sounded less glamorous than fashion design, and occasionally underestimated Sophie herself because they confused softness with weakness. What troubled her was everything that happened after. A photograph appeared online showing Sophie standing beside Matteo. The caption called her the Mafia boss's personal tailor. Another described her as his latest discovery. Neither mentioned Bennett Alterations until several paragraphs later. Matteo had done nothing wrong. That was the problem. His name was simply too large. It entered a room before he did, and remained after he left. A week later, when Matteo came for a fitting, Sophie told him the truth. I don't know how to be around you without becoming something attached to you. Matteo said nothing. Sophie continued. In my shop, I'm Sophie Bennett. Outside it, suddenly I'm your tailor, your guest, someone you're helping. I've never thought of you that way. I know. That made him look at her. She folded the measuring tape in her hands. But other people do. Matteo could have offered solutions. He had enough money to manufacture 100 of them before dinner. A public statement, a publicity campaign, business opportunities designed to prove Sophie's independence. Instead, he asked one question. What do you need? Sophie hesitated. Space. Something in his face became still. Then he nodded. All right. And gave it to her. Completely. The following week, Matteo did not visit. Neither did his jackets. The week after that, Sophie caught herself looking toward the door when the bell rang. It was never him. By the third week, she realized she had become irritated by an absence she had personally requested. Even Matteo's bodyguards were gone. No black coats in the waiting area. No numbered ticket held between expensive fingers. No absurd garment bag containing a perfectly healthy jacket, suffering from imaginary problems. The shop felt normal again. Sophie had wanted normal. Apparently, normal had become strangely quiet. Then Daniel asked her to dinner. Not casually, not hidden behind coffee or a fitting, a real date. You don't have to answer immediately, he said. Sophie smiled. Daniel was kind, handsome, successful, comfortable. Being with him would be easy. There would be no whispers when they entered a room. No newspapers attaching significance to a cup of coffee. No billionaire business empire casting a shadow over her small tailoring shop. Sophie should have wanted easy. Instead, she thought about a terrifying man sitting beneath a sign that said, "Please take a number." She thought about Matteo, waiting 40 minutes,
while an elderly customer told her the history of an old wool coat. She thought about $12 coffee, and a man powerful enough to ignore almost every boundary in the world who had respected hers the moment she asked for space. "I need a little time," she told Daniel. He smiled. "Take it." 3 days later, the bell over Bennett Alterations rang. Sophie looked up. Matteo stood inside the door, alone. He carried one garment bag. Her heart reacted before her common sense could object. She immediately looked at the bag. "What did you do to it?" "Nothing. That's unlikely." He placed it on the counter. Sophie unzipped the bag. A dark navy suit. She inspected the jacket first. Shoulders balanced correctly. Collar clean. Sleeves perfect. No pulling, no twisting. She checked the trousers. Perfect break. Perfect waist. Perfect drape. Sophie became suspicious. She made him put it on. Then she examined everything again. Matteo stood silently while she circled him. Finally, Sophie stepped back. "There's nothing wrong with this suit." "I know." She stared at him. "You know?" "Yes." "Then why did you bring it?" Matteo looked almost uncomfortable. For anyone else, the change would have been invisible. Sophie knew him better now. "I needed an excuse." The word settled between them. Sophie looked at the perfectly fitted suit, then back at the man wearing it. You control approximately half the city, and this is the best excuse you could invent?" "Apparently not around you." Despite herself, Sophie smiled. Matteo did not. "The first jacket brought me back, because you saw something nobody else had." His voice was quieter now. "The second time, I was curious." Sophie raised an eyebrow. "The jacket with absolutely nothing wrong with it?" "That one." "And after that?" A pause. "After that, most of the clothes were excuses." Sophie had suspected it. Hearing him admit it felt entirely different. "You deliberately brought me a loose button." "Possibly. It wasn't loose. I became aware of that. I charged you $10. I remember." Sophie almost laughed. Then Matteo's expression changed. "I wanted to see you." The humor disappeared. Not awkwardly. Honestly. "I liked being here," he said. "At first I thought it was because nobody treated me differently." His eyes held hers. "Then I realized it was because you didn't." Sophie said nothing. Matteo continued. "You told me the truth when you were afraid of me. You charged me when I wasted your time. You made me wait." A faint smile touched his mouth. "And somehow, I kept finding reasons to come back." Sophie looked at him for a long moment. "Why didn't you just ask me to dinner?" Matteo Rinaldi, a man who negotiated with people who feared disappointing him, had no immediate answer. Then he gave her the only honest one. "Because I wasn't certain you'd say yes." There it was. Not power, not confidence, not command. Uncertainty. He had given Sophie space because she asked. Now he had returned without assuming she owed him anything. For once, Matteo was not trying to make the world move toward him. He was waiting again. Sophie smiled. "Dinner." Matteo watched her carefully. "Is that a yes?" "It's a yes." His expression barely changed, but Sophie saw the relief. She pointed at the suit. "Consultation fee still applies." Matteo looked down at himself. "For a suit to admit is perfect?" "You made me inspect it twice." A pause. "How much?" Sophie smiled. $35. Matteo reached for his wallet, and just like that, Sophie knew they might actually have a chance. Months later, Bennett alterations still belonged entirely to Sophie. Matteo never bought the shop, changed its name, or used his money to rewrite the life she had built for herself. He simply kept showing up. He took a number. He waited his turn. He respected her work, listened when she said no, and gave her space when she asked for it. The first time Matteo entered the shop, he believed power meant never having to wait. Sophie taught him something harder. Real affection could not be ordered, purchased, or rushed. It had to be offered freely. And when Matteo finally returned without a damaged jacket or a false excuse, Sophie chose him. No number required. Would you have given Matteo a chance after everything, or kept him as just another customer? Share your answer below, and subscribe for more unexpected Mafia romance stories.